Have you ever believed in something so deeply, so unquestionably, because the world insisted it was true, until a single moment revealed that the world itself had been wrong all along? It is strange how certain ideas about nations and people linger like shadows, passed from one conversation to another, accepted without challenge simply because they are repeated often enough. And when it comes to the Philippines, there is a quiet assumption that has persisted for decades, whispered in boardrooms, classrooms, and diplomatic halls, that the Philippines is small, struggling, and forgettable. A place full of good people, yes, but not a place that world leaders look to with admiration or respect. What if I told you that this assumption is not only misleading, it is shattered every single day behind closed doors, where the most powerful people on earth speak truths they rarely reveal publicly? Imagine this. A prime minister, known for his composure, sits alone after a meeting. For a moment, the cameras are off, the advisor's gone, and the diplomatic mask falls away. His eyes soften, not out of pity, but out of respect. He whispers something almost no one hears. A single sentence that, if the world knew it, would change how millions of Filipinos see themselves. And then imagine another moment. An American CEO, celebrated for his influence and wealth, is asked privately which country left the deepest mark on him. His answer is so unexpected that the room falls silent. He does not say Switzerland or Japan or Singapore. He says the Philippines, and his voice does not waver. These are not fantasies. They are fragments of a truth the world rarely broadcasts, because admiration, real admiration, is often expressed in quiet, unguarded moments. And when those moments involve the Philippines, they carry a surprising intensity. Why would someone with access to every comfort, every resource, every opportunity, speak with awe about a country that the world still dares to underestimate? The answer begins with a man named Jonathan Hale. Jonathan was not a celebrity, not a politician, not a man seeking attention. He was a historian from Oxford, a consultant invited to analyze Southeast Asian political dynamics for several Western governments. He had traveled to 70 countries, lived in 10, and believed he understood how nations rise and fall. The Philippines, to him, was simply another developing nation. Warm people, complicated politics, rich culture, but nothing extraordinary. At least that's what he thought. What he did not expect was that a single encounter would rewrite everything he believed about power, dignity, faith, and resilience. What he did not expect was to become the kind of man who would later defend the Philippines in front of leaders who had dismissed it for too long. But before any transformation begins, there is always a wound, a fracture, a moment when a person realizes that life is not as stable as they imagined. Jonathan's life began unraveling long before he ever stepped foot in Southeast Asia. He carried an illness that no doctor in London could fully diagnose. It stole his sleep, blurred his vision, weakened his hands. The kind of illness that doesn't kill the body, but slowly erodes the spirit. He sought treatment in the United States, Germany, Singapore, each time meeting polished smiles and empty promises. He was surrounded by technology, by expertise, by some of the most expensive healthcare systems in the world. But none of them offered what he truly needed: hope. And in the middle of this quiet collapse, he met a Filipino physician during a conference in Geneva. A woman who listened, really listened, in a way no other doctor had. She did not rush him. She did not interrupt. She simply placed her hand gently on the table and asked a question no one had asked him before. "Do you still believe you can get better?" He didn't know how to answer. That conversation lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes that planted a thought he didn't fully understand yet. a thought that would lead him across the world to a place he never once imagined he would go, a place he had dismissed without realizing it, a place that would change him forever. The Philippines. And what world leaders really say about the Philippines, what they say when the microphones are off, begins with the story of one man who arrived believing the world's illusions and left understanding the world's truth. Jonathan had always believed that struggle was something that happened to other people. His life had been built on predictability. Well-funded research, polished conferences, quiet dinners in European cities where conversations sounded important but rarely touched the soul. Yet beneath that polished surface, something inside him was collapsing. The illness that gnawed at him became a daily companion, one he tried to bury under work and logic. But pain has a way of stripping away illusions, and his illusions began to crumble faster than he could rebuild them. Doctors in London ran their tests. Specialists in Boston suggested new scans. A hospital in Tokyo recommended experimental therapy. Every place he sought answers felt cold, efficient, distant. He remembered sitting in a pristine white corridor in Massachusetts General Hospital while a nurse rushed past without even looking at him. He remembered a German neurologist adjusting his glasses 3 times before saying, "We cannot promise improvement." He remembered the slow sinking inside his chest, the suffocating thought that he had reached the end of what money and influence could buy. Illness does something strange to a person. It makes the world feel smaller, lonelier. Jonathan began waking up at night, unable to recognize himself. There were mornings when he struggled to hold a pen, days when his reflection in the mirror looked older than his years, nights when he wondered if this was the universe's quiet way of closing a chapter he wasn't ready to end. And in the middle of that despair, something else in his life began to unravel. His work, once his anchor, became unbearable. He traveled to Dubai for a summit on global economic futures and collapsed backstage. He flew to Canberra to advise on Southeast Asian maritime security, but couldn't finish his briefing. Colleagues who once praised his brilliance now avoided meeting his eyes, as if acknowledging his suffering would make it too real. Hopelessness is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a slow erosion, a quiet fading of color. That was Jonathan's world, a canvas draining itself of light. It was during one of those fading days, at a small research gathering in Geneva, that he again crossed paths with the Filipino physician he'd spoken to briefly months earlier. Her name, he learned, was Dr. Selena Ramos. She remembered him. Not just his face, but the tremor in his hand, the tightness in his voice. She asked how he'd been, and he couldn't find the strength to lie. There was something profoundly disarming in the way she listened. When she spoke, her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. She mentioned a community hospital in Manila where she occasionally volunteered. Not a world-famous institution, not a place drowning in accolades or awards, just a place where, she said softly, healing wasn't only measured by machines. Jonathan didn't fully understand what she meant, but he felt something shift, a faint crack in the wall he'd built around his hope. And then she shared something that startled him. "You know," she said, almost as if revealing a secret, "our world leaders look at the Philippines and see things they never mention publicly: strength, faith, human depth." She paused and looked at him with a sadness that carried compassion. "I wish you could see what they see." It was a strange moment, a moment so unlike the sterile exchanges he'd grown used to. He didn't know why her words lingered. He didn't know why he replayed them on the flight back to London, or why he found himself searching for information about Philippine healthcare systems late at night. But sometimes, The smallest conversations become the turning points we don't recognize until later. And Jonathan, exhausted, defeated, desperate, couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was meant to follow that faint thread she'd left him. He didn't yet believe in miracles, but he was beginning, for the first time in a long while, to believe in possibility. Jonathan did not plan his journey to the Philippines with confidence or excitement. It wasn't a bold decision made with clarity. It was more like a quiet surrender, an exhausted man finally letting go of the belief that healing could only be found in places stamped with prestige. He booked the flight 2 weeks after speaking with Dr. Selina. Even then, he hesitated every step of the way. At Heathrow, he almost turned back. In Dubai, during a layover, he stared at his connection gate as if it were a mistake written in bold letters. And when his plane descended toward Manila, he told himself this would be temporary, a curiosity at best, a desperate stretch of hope at worst. But the moment he stepped out of the airport, something unexpected happened. A warm breeze touched his face, not just warm in temperature, but warm in presence, in spirit, almost like a welcome he had not earned. And then he saw something he had never seen in any airport in Europe or the United States. Strangers smiling at him for no reason. A porter waved even though Jonathan wasn't his customer. A family stood aside to give him space, nodding politely. A woman holding a baby offered him a small smile that felt like sunlight. It unsettled him at first. Kindness without calculation always does. On his way to the hospital recommended by Dr. Selina, he noticed details that felt strangely intimate. Vendors laughing with strangers, jeepney drivers helping passengers carry groceries, a security guard offering directions with genuine patience. These were small moments, but they were moments of life. Not mechanical, not hurried, not transactional. And they pierced through the numbness he'd been living with. The hospital itself was not imposing. It wasn't the marble and steel fortress he had grown used to. It was modest, almost humble, painted in soft colors and carrying the unmistakable scent of antiseptic, mixed with the faint aroma of home-cooked food from outside. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt seen. Not as a patient number, not as a case, but as a human being. A nurse approached him. The kind of nurse you remember not because of her uniform, but because of the sincerity in her eyes. Her name was Leah. She took one look at him and said gently, "You must be tired. Let's take this slowly." There was no rush, no pressure, no hint of frustration. She held his arm lightly, not to control him, but to guide him. And that one gesture nearly broke him. He had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for in a way that wasn't clinical. For days, Jonathan observed this quiet compassion. When nurses spoke to elderly patients, their voices softened. When a child cried, someone always knelt to eye level. When patients prayed, others joined without embarrassment. Every hallway felt like a small chapter of humanity unfolding between strangers who refused to stay strangers. One afternoon, while waiting for test results, Jonathan drifted toward the hospital chapel. The door was slightly open, and inside, a small group of patients were praying together. Some were strong, some were weak, some were too sick to even kneel, but all of them carried the same look, a mixture of pain and hope intertwined. A young man held his mother's hand. A woman whose head was covered with a scarf whispered words of gratitude despite her suffering, and Jonathan felt something unfamiliar rising within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Peace. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't miraculous. It was simply the feeling of being in a place where people believed, not because everything was perfect, but because they had chosen to believe anyway. That night, Jonathan realized something quietly transformative. In a world that measured success by power and wealth, He had traveled across continents only to discover the one thing he had been missing in the most unexpected place. Kindness. The kind that doesn't demand anything. The kind that doesn't perform for cameras. The kind that radiates from people who have suffered enough to understand the value of compassion. And standing in a Manila hospital room with the hum of life around him, he began to question everything he had assumed about this country. Everything the world had assumed. Was this why world leaders spoke differently about the Philippines when the microphones were off? Was this the truth they felt, but rarely revealed? Jonathan didn't have answers yet. But he knew one thing with certainty. He was no longer the same man who had arrived. Jonathan woke the next morning not with sudden strength, but with a clarity he had not felt in years. It was subtle, almost delicate, like the first hint of dawn touching a window. Something inside him was shifting. Not his illness, not his body, but the heaviness around his spirit. He found himself watching people more closely, listening more deeply, absorbing the rhythms of the place as if the Philippines were speaking to him in a language made not of words, but of gestures, warmth, and faith. Every day brought moments he could not ignore. In the hospital courtyard, he saw an elderly man, frail and trembling, trying to walk alone. Two caregivers crossed the space without hesitation, one holding his arm, the other steadying his steps. They walked slowly, matching his pace, speaking to him softly in Tagalog. Jonathan didn't understand the words, but he understood the tenderness. It was the kind of care he had never seen even in the most advanced medical centers of Europe. It was care rooted in humanity, not protocol. One afternoon, a young nurse named Mariel noticed Jonathan sitting by the window, staring at the sky with that distant look people wear when they feel lost inside themselves. She approached him without any agenda and asked, "Sir Jonathan, do you want to join us outside? The others are praying the rosary. You don't have to join. You can just sit with us." He nearly refused out of habit. He had never been religious, and vulnerability still frightened him. But something in her voice made him nod. Outside, patients and staff had formed a loose circle under a tree. Some sat, some stood, some leaned against wheelchairs. When the soft murmur of prayer began, Jonathan didn't feel excluded. He felt held by a community that didn't even know him, yet welcomed him without question. He sat in silence while the prayers floated around him like a blanket of warmth. He could feel the air shift, gently, as if the collective hope of these people created its own kind of healing. And he realized, almost painfully, that he had spent years surrounded by brilliance, efficiency, intellect, yet he had never been surrounded by this kind of love. Little by little, he began participating in simple routines, sharing meals with nurses, chatting with volunteers, listening to the stories of patients who had far less than he did, but smiled far more easily. A tricycle driver with a sick daughter told him, "We pray for miracles every day. Some days we get small ones." "Small is enough." A mother caring for her autistic son said, "Life is hard, sir, but love makes it lighter." A janitor wiping the floor paused to say, "Don't lose heart, sir. Your strength will come back." Jonathan was overwhelmed, not because these people pretended life was easy, but because they fought their battles with grace, with humor, with enduring faith. He remembered once telling a diplomat friend that developing nations lacked resilience. Now he realized how blind he had been. The Philippines held a strength forged not through stability, but through the storms its people had endured, disasters, poverty, heartbreak, loss. And yet they smiled, they shared, they prayed, they rose again and again. That is when the transformation began. One morning, while leaning against the hallway wall after a round of physical therapy, Jonathan watched a nurse bring food to a patient who had no relatives visiting. She placed the meal gently beside him and said, "We're your family too, okay?" The patient, weak and barely able to speak, whispered something Jonathan didn't catch. Yet the gratitude in his eyes made Jonathan's breath catch. He felt his own eyes sting. Tears, unexpected and uninvited, blurred his vision. For the first time since his illness began, he let them fall. It wasn't sadness, it was release, it was awakening. "I have never seen this anywhere else," he whispered to himself. And he knew then that this country, this place he had underestimated, this place the world had underestimated, was giving him more than treatment. It was giving him humanity. It was giving him the strength to believe again. The Philippines was slowly stitching him back together. Not through technology or prestige, but through compassion so real, so constant, that even the strongest walls of despair could not withstand it. "The Philippines has restored my faith in humanity," he murmured, almost afraid of how true it felt. But it was true, more true than anything he had ever spoken, and he knew. His story with this country was far from over. Jonathan stayed in the Philippines longer than he intended. At first, he told himself it was only until the next test result, or until the next medical evaluation, or until he felt steady enough to travel home. But days blended into weeks, and his heart began learning something his mind was only beginning to understand. Healing wasn't always about medicine. Sometimes it was about a place, a people, a way of being, and the Philippines had become the quiet pulse guiding him back to himself. His improvement came slowly, almost imperceptibly. One morning he realized his hands weren't shaking as much. Another day, he walked across the courtyard without needing to pause. A month later, he found himself laughing, really laughing, at a joke a volunteer made while helping rearrange chairs in the chapel. It startled him. Laughter felt foreign, like a language he had forgotten. But here, it returned to him with ease. Then came the moment he knew he would never forget. During a follow-up examination, Dr. Selena studied his test results with a calm, focused expression. Jonathan braced for disappointment, for the familiar weight of bad news. Instead, she looked at him with a gentle smile. "You're getting stronger," she said. "Not just physically. Something in you changed." Jonathan swallowed hard because he knew she was right. Something had changed, something essential. He had come to the Philippines searching for treatment. He had found life. In conversations with local doctors, with tricycle drivers, with mothers, students, and janitors, he discovered truths he had been blind to for years. He saw how faith wasn't merely tradition here, it was a lifeline. He saw how compassion wasn't charity, it was culture. He saw how resilience wasn't a headline after a typhoon. It was the quiet, daily strength in every Filipino heart. And slowly, the statements he'd once heard whispered by world leaders began to make sense. A European diplomat had once told him, "The Philippines teaches the world how to endure." A Middle Eastern prince had said privately, "I admire their grace under suffering. It humbles us." A well-known American general had confessed after a disaster operation, "The Filipino spirit is unbreakable, stronger than most armies I've seen." Back then, Jonathan didn't fully grasp those words. Now he understood them with a depth that no textbook could convey. The Philippines did not just help him survive. The Philippines helped him return to being human. On the morning he was finally discharged, he stood outside the hospital and watched people pass by, students rushing to class, families holding hands, workers laughing as they shared bread. It struck him then how extraordinary this place truly was. Not because it had wealth or political influence, but because it carried something far more powerful. Heart. He knew he couldn't return to his old life unchanged. He didn't want to. Instead of flying back to London, he applied to spend 6 more months in Manila, contributing research to a local university. And when people asked him why, he answered honestly, "Because the Philippines saved me, and I want to understand the country that the world talks about behind closed doors with such deep respect." Jonathan would later speak at a global forum in front of leaders from 20 nations. Cameras flashed, journalists waited for sound bites, and instead of citing statistics or political strategies, he said something simple. "The world underestimates the Philippines because it measures strength the wrong way. This country is not small. Its people carry a strength that could teach nations how to be human again." The room fell silent. Some leaders nodded with recognition, because they already knew. They had seen what he had seen, felt what he had felt, but rarely said it aloud. And perhaps that is the real truth behind the Philippines. The admiration world leaders hold is not always spoken publicly, not always printed in reports, not always broadcast on global news. It is carried in private conversations, in quiet acknowledgments, in the respect they rarely admit openly. Because the Philippines is not just admired for its courage or faith or kindness, it is admired because it reminds the world of something it is slowly forgetting. Hope. Hope that survives storms. Hope that grows in suffering. Hope that shines through humility. Hope that heals even those who arrive believing they are beyond healing. Jonathan came searching for answers. He found a country that rewrote his understanding of humanity. And he found a truth that deserves to be spoken out loud, without fear, without hesitation. In a world shaken by conflict and division, the Philippines stands as living proof that compassion is still powerful, that resilience is still possible, and that faith, quiet, steadfast, and unshakable, still moves people toward light. For the Filipino watching this, may you feel proud. For the foreigner watching, may you feel curiosity and respect. Because what world leaders really say about the Philippines is not a secret anymore. They say this nation is extraordinary, and they are right.